Did y'all see the new report out this past week from the Centers for Disease Control showing that the United States fertility rate has hit an all-time low in the history of our nation? There are now fewer than 1.6 children being born for every woman in the United States. Previously, the United States was one of the few developed countries that actually met replacement. Our birth rate was 2.1 children for every woman. That creates a stable population. We had a tiny bit of growth. We've not only witnessed a steady decline in our birth rate, we've seen women waiting until they were older and older to have their first child. Now, we could get into a long conversation about population dynamics and what it means when your country is having a rapid birth rate and the majority of your population is quite young. But a lot of Western European countries and some Asian countries have noticed the opposite problem, which is that they are far below replacement, which creates an aging population and a whole host of problems, including you lack the adult workforce to care for that aging population. You do not have wage earners to replace folks as they retire. You end up with this tipped scale where a large portion of the population is older. They're no longer working. They're no longer contributing to the economy in the same way, and they end up needing more caregiving, and yet there aren't people to do that. Now, I know why on the surface it might seem like it's a good thing to have a low birth rate, especially because so many folks here in the States still believe the overpopulation myth, which is based on a book called The Population Bomb from the 1970s, which is a real racist, eugenicist piece of work. You should go read it. Actually, if you don't want to read it because it's very badly written, I recommend the podcast If Books Could Kill. They did an episode on the population bomb, which I think has a couple of flaws in it, but overall is a pretty good and comprehensive breakdown of the book. So on the surface, a lot of Americans think, yay, lower birth rate is a good thing for our country. Nope, it sure is not. It creates a whole host of problems. My 17-year-old and I just did a unit on population dynamics less than a year ago, so I'm pretty fresh on this subject and the current data. But having a very high birth rate is not a good thing either. The countries with the highest birth rate are Chad, Somalia, and Democratic Republic of Congo, I believe. Their birth rate is almost 6 children for every woman. That extremely high birth rates often correlate with a lack of education and a lack of access to reproductive care and birth care. Having a very high birth rate means that your population could be growing rapidly. Unfortunately, countries with a very high birth rate often have a high child mortality rate and a low life expectancy. So we know that socioeconomic factors, cultural factors, a lack of autonomy for women, a lack of education, a lack of access to medical care can contribute to very high birth rates. And we know that in particular, when women have access to education and reproductive care, that birth rates fall quite steeply. Right now, the global birth rate is something like 2.3 children for every woman. And let's compare to a country with sort of similar socioeconomic and educational standards. The United Kingdom, their birth rate is 2.1. Again, the United States has fallen to below 1.6. We are below replacement, and now we are watching a heavy immigration crackdown. Countries that usually have a very low birth rate rely on immigration in order to meet their labor needs, in order to have workers functioning in their economy and keeping their economy going. But we are now seeing not only a reduction in the number of people that are being allowed into this country, dramatic reduction. We are also seeing people who have been working in this country for years, potentially decades, who are being kicked out or they're being rounded up and stuffed into concentration camps. So we have this steeply falling birth rate, and we also no longer have immigration. That's a real bad scene for our economy long term. And just like there can be socioeconomic and cultural factors that are not so great that create a very high birth rate, there can be lots of very negative socioeconomic, cultural factors, stressors that can absolutely tank a birth rate. In particular, throughout history, when we see the rise of fascism, we see steeply declining birth rates. And that really freaks the fascists out. Like it really freaks them out. We know that countries like Russia have offered women bonuses to have more children because women don't want to reproduce in a climate where they can't access healthcare for themselves and their children. It's difficult for them to keep a roof over their children's heads, to keep their children fed. When women in particular feel that there is not a lot to hope for in the future, when they're very stressed out and it feels like they are not bringing a child into a world where they can offer them hope and they can offer them a bright future, if those women have access to birth control, they will not be reproducing. And strangely enough, the fascists in this country, the Christo-fascists in particular, who are obsessed with women's fecundity, have been really worried about our dropping birth rate since before the election. But now that they are in power, we are seeing very much the rollout of a pro-natalist agenda. The pressure for women to embrace a traditional motherly role. And I say that as somebody who was a stay-at-home homeschool parent of 4 children, well above the replacement rate in this country, who absolutely leans into a lot of traditional domestic roles and responsibilities that women take on and that are lauded and praised under fascism. And by the evangelicals on the far right, by the Heritage Foundation. However, I am well aware of the fact that that is not all there is to me. And I am well aware of the fact that anybody can be a homemaker. Anybody can be responsible for caregiving, no matter what their gender is. And that is not all that comprises who they are. But for the Christo-fascists, they want that to be all there is for women. They just want you to have babies. They want you to be keepers of the home and a helpmeet to your husband. And we know through this kind of quiverful mentality that there is a fixation on having more and more children, whether or not you can actually provide for them. Men under these kinds of systems just want to have their quiver full of arrows as a visible demonstration to everybody of their virility. But for the far right, especially for dominionist Christo-fascists, especially for white supremacists who are terrified of the Great Replacement theory, where they don't want to be outbred and see that the number of white people in the United States is declining, birth rates matter to them a lot. The fact that Gen Z is the first generation in the history of the United States that is not majority white, that freaks them the fuck out. And you know who else got freaked out about steeply falling birth rates under fascism? You know who else didn't respond well to the fact that in a repressive authoritarian regime, women don't want to have babies? Benito Mussolini. I actually want to draw your attention to Ruth Ben-Ghiat's Substack. I don't know if you follow her work. She's a historian whose expertise is authoritarian leaders, but she had a piece that came out last year, well before the election, back in September, entitled "The Fascist Roots of the Far Right's Obsession with Childlessness and Population Management." I mean, we've seen for a while folks like J.D. Vance who want to denigrate women who choose not to reproduce, this vilification of the childless cat lady, as if a woman's only worth is tied to her fecundity, as if a woman's value is inherently derived from achieving the status of motherhood and reproducing. That's very much a mentality from men on the right. So let me just read you the very first part of this Substack article. And we know that fascism and eugenics, they're like this, right? That whoever is in charge of a fascist regime, they're obsessed with racial purity and making sure that folks who are like them take over. And consistently, they are like, we have to outbreed them. And actually, the far right in the United States, that's a big part of the quiverful movement. It's a big part of the attitude of all kinds of fundamentalist sects and religious groups, from evangelical Christians to Mormons in this country, is like, we're just going to outbreed them. We'll play the long game. We'll play a generational game. If we shrink, gentlemen, we won't make the empire, we'll become the colony, said Benito Mussolini back in 1927 when he was addressing other fascists in parliament. Ruth Ben-Ghiat says that Mussolini warned Italians of a racial emergency, contrasting fertile peoples of color in Africa and Asia with Europeans who risked extinction. Cradles are empty and cemeteries are expanding, Mussolini declared. The entire white race, the Western race, could be submerged by other races of color that multiply with a rhythm unknown to our own. Mussolini banned abortion and contraception, which of course at the time earned Mussolini the favor of the Catholic Church. Ben-Ghiat goes on to talk about eerie similarities between Mussolini and J.D. Vance. In particular, the way that Vance views women as a tool of demographic growth, and that motherhood is the metric of a woman's worth in society. Also of concern is that Vance seems to hold the position that the postmenopausal female has no other purpose in society other than to raise grandchildren. Vance has blamed childless women for the supposed increasing decadence in American society and the decline of our civilization. Fascist regimes like the one in the US inevitably bring a falling birth rate, which feeds into the fascists' worst fears about Great Replacement and the decline of white people. It becomes inevitable that fascists want to control women's reproduction to boost the birth rate.